So for this week, we've got a data set. They say two characteristics, surface material and length, and we're asked to check if they're independent of one another. So we have a test for that. And by the way, what it means independent means one, like the value of one doesn't impact the value of the other. Okay, so we have a test for that, the chi-square test of independence. But the chi-square test of independence only works for counts in categorical variables. We've been doing a lot of regression. Those are quantitative variables where they're numbers, and we have a formula. We don't have to do a lot of conversions. For the chi-square test of independence, you've got to convert your variable to a category if it isn't already. So it's tricky because if your data is quantitative like this is, then there's probably some other test that you should be using rather than breaking it up into a category. But we're asked to break up the runway length into a category, and specifically what they say is that they want it, where is it? To be the category of greater than or less than 500 feet for the runway length. Okay, so we got to change this to we're going to change it to either a 1 or a 0. A 1 meaning yes, it's greater than 5,000 feet, and 0 meaning no, it's not greater than 5,000 feet, it's less than 5,000 feet. Okay, so once we convert this column to ones and zeros, then we'll also be able to use this column to see whether runway surface type is independent of runway length. I don't know if we'll have to convert this one because this is already a category. I think StatCrunch can handle that, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Okay, greater than 500 is what I'm going to call this column. 5,000, sorry, 5,000. I said 500 earlier. And by the way, you'll notice that my numbers are different than your numbers. I randomize it again just so I don't give away the answers. So in the cell horizontal from D2, from the runway length, I'm going to type this in. I'm going to type equals. Hold on, let me see if I can zoom in to make that bigger. Kind of. I'm going to say equals if my cell D2, if it's greater than 5,000, so that's checking whatever number's in that cell, and I'm programming it as a cell. That way I can just drag this and it'll repeat it for D3, D4, D5. Okay. So if D2 is greater than 5,000, then we're going to say 1. That's our categorical variable. Or we could say yes. You could change it. And I think StatCrunch can handle letters as well, but we usually just use ones and zeros to make it simpler. So if it's greater than 5,000, it's a 1. And then what goes after the next comma is what you do if it's not greater than 5,000. And we want to say the value is 0 if it's not greater than 5,000. That way, 1 represents greater than 5,000. And then here comes our first 0. 0 represents something less than 5,000. So now we've categorized it according to the assignment instructions. And again, anytime you take a quantitative variable and you categorize it, then you're opening yourself up to some potential problems. Because you've got a lot of probably borderline cases. What if something's 4,900 and the next one's 5,100? They're in two completely different categories, although quantitatively they're not very different. Okay, so that's the first part. We got to change that to categories. Okay, so I've got the data copied over to StatCrunch. I've got them both in columns. If it's greater than 5,000, you could rename this if you want, but that means those runways that were categorized as being greater than 5,000, forgot what the units were, feet or meters, and then the type of runway surface area. So to run the chi-square test of independence, we would go to tables, contingency, and then with data, because we haven't summarized them into one nice contingency table. What you could do is you could make two columns, one be greater than 5,000, one be less than 5,000. And then for rows, you'd have to make a ton of rows because there's a ton of different types of runway surface. So that would take a long time to summarize it. So we're going to let StatCrunch do that, and it can do that with the numbers that we have. It actually, I don't think it should matter which one's row and column. It'll just change the output. Make sure it's chi-square test of independence. We can hit compute, and there's our results. So you see a p-value, but we need to know what the null and alternative hypothesis before we can interpret what the p-value is telling us. So for a chi-square test of independence, the null hypothesis is that the two are independent. because the standard assumption there is that no, the asphalt type doesn't impact the runway length. The alternative hypothesis would be that it's incorrect that they're independent, meaning some of the asphalt types do influence whether it's greater than or less than 5,000 feet for a runway length. Okay, feet or meters, I don't remember what they said. And so you can follow along with the results, but the problem is there's a bunch of different asphalt types. That's it. There's just a ton of them. And they note that over 20% of cells have an expected count less than 5. So that it's kind of like outliers where you have just this one category with one type. So there's a couple others here. So one thing we could do for our discussion is we could say, hey, I put all the turf categories together. Okay, and the way you could do that is you could, here I'll show you in just a second in Excel. That would take more work. You'd have to categorize it, but or you could just go through. Actually, what would be easier is you could just go through in dirt F. You could delete that and add one to, you could just delete the F, delete the G, delete the P, make those all just be one dirt category. That would probably be the quickest way. And that way you're comparing dirt, and then you could compare just asphalt directly instead of this extra specification. Okay, because that's potentially throwing off our results. So I would say all these categories with just one in them, we probably should combine those into other turf gravel ones. You could look up, I don't remember in the key what turf G is, but if that stands for gravel, you could add one to this count. You could just change the name of this, and then StatCrunch will be able to we'll count that under the turf G category. Okay, so consider combining some of those. That way we don't get this warning anymore at the bottom. Yeah, so fixing that might change your results. But also remember, I randomize my numbers, so my numbers won't be the same exact ones as yours that you're supposed to get from the discussion board. But that's the basics. The way we can clean up the data is by changing some of those categories where there's only one or two in them, by changing the name so that it groups them in with the other categories so that we don't have this warning happening in StatCrunch anymore. Okay, but let me know if you have questions. That's the basics of the calculations. That's all the calculations we need to do. The rest of it's just cleaning up the data, combining those categories potentially once you look up the category names and see if they're worthy of being combined with one another.